Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Ry Barcott from With Honor. With Honor fights polarization in Congress, and this session, I believe, is titled Bipartisanship, Can We Be Friends? I will put one spoiler in the introduction, which is that we are all friends. We have gotten to know each other over the last 5 years. With Honor's been around for about 5 years. We help recruit, train, and then elect and support principled veterans like Representative Tony Gonzales and Representative Jason Crow, who have taken a pledge to serve across party lines with integrity, civility, and courage. It is possible. We're going to hear a little bit more about that. Part of the reason why we started the organization is because veteran representation in Congress is at an all-time low. It's about 20% of Congress. Not long ago, it was up to over 70%. In fact, Senator Graham, I'm sure, can recall some of the days when we had more vets in Congress, and good to have you here, Senator. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to someone that needs no introduction, Katie Couric, who's on the Aspen Institute board. But just want to say one thing about my friends, Tony Gonzales and Jason Crow. They are the co-chairs of the 4-country caucus. That's 4 FOR. It's 30 representatives now, 50-50, roughly equal between Republicans and Democrats. They meet routinely, and you'll hear more about what they have gotten done, including over 79 laws passed in the last 4 years. Congressman Crow is from Colorado, not far from here, and served in the Army as a Ranger. He served in Afghanistan and Iraq before running for Congress. And Congressman Gonzales represents the district down in Texas, one of the largest districts in the United States, right along the border of Texas. You may have heard his session earlier today about immigration, kicked us off at 9 a.m. And he is a retired Navy Master Chief, which is one of the most respected ranks in the Navy. He was a cryptologist. He retired. That means that he served 20 years, and then he answered the call to serve again and ran for office. So without further ado, Ms. Couric, over to you.
Thank you. I'm good. I have my little time life. Hey, Senator Graham, nice to see you. Haven't seen you in so long. Great to have you here. Hi, everybody. Well, this is going to be a great conversation because according to an NPR PBS NewsHour Marist poll, 74% of Americans want Congress to compromise, but 58% of those respondents said they have absolutely no confidence Congress will actually do so. So we're going to talk about compromise, what you all are doing together as a Democrat and a Republican, and then I'll open it up for questions. And thank you all for coming to this panel. We're a little bummed because we're competing against the Supreme Court, which is kind of in the news today. So, but this is such an important issue, and I'm really happy to have you both here today. You know, why do you think there's such an abysmal lack of confidence by the American people in the U.S. Congress? I'll start with you, Congressman Crow. I mean, what is going on, and is it warranted, actually?
Well, thanks, Katie, and thanks to the Aspen Institute for the invitation today. It's wonderful to be here. The answer, like all of these things, is complicated, right? So the reputation of Congress as an ineffective body is in many ways justified, right? Major things, major challenges are not being addressed, and we have hit gridlock on some of the most formative challenges of our day. But there are also a lot of things that are getting done, and there is a lot of collaboration, and there is a lot of people like Tony and I and others who do great things that also get no coverage.
Right.
Right. And I don't want to, I'm not going to, this is not, don't get me wrong, this is not a blame the media, but there is an infrastructure that is developed between social media, cable news, and the information that people receive, that they're being served, but they also opt in to receive, right? People are now opting and curating their own information, and it's self-selecting, where they get a sense that everything is gridlock.
Right.
That nothing gets done. And yet you heard at the beginning that Tony and I and the 4-country caucus have passed over 79 bills into law over the last couple of years with our caucus. I served on the Small Business Committee my first 4 years in Congress. And in 1 year, we that committee unanimously passed 36 small business bills, every Republican, every Democrat. And of course, that gets 0 ink. right? So we are encountering this major challenge of getting the message out about our project and what we're doing and the work that we are doing to restore that civility, and it's hard to get the word out.
Yeah, Tony, may I call you Tony and
Yeah,
Jason?
please, of course.
Tony, how frustrating is it for you that, I mean, it's true, and I was the co-chair of the Aspen Commission on Disinformation, and as somebody who is still very involved in media, I feel your pain, and I know where you're coming from. But, you know, how frustrating, Tony, is it for you that when you do get things done, it gets zero attention?
It can be. It can be very frustrating because you work so hard on a project. There's a couple ways to put a bill together. One is on the back of a napkin, throw it against a wall, and blame the other side for why it didn't stick. A lot of people run that play over and over again. The more difficult part is navigating it through the process that we have. And that takes time and energy, and when you do that and it comes on the other side and you get this win, but you also, what's special about serving on the Four Country Caucus, you have a lot of members that don't really care about the media aspect of it. Mm-hmm. They're not, and members are in Congress for different reasons. Some want fame, some want fortune, some are there to problem solve, some are there to cause problems. Just is very different of what is a win for them. And a win for people isn't always passing a bill.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes it's just getting up and saying crazy stuff.
Or being an obstructionist.
Obstructionist, exactly. Shutting things down, creating chaos. So that's the frustrating part, but it's also kind of fun too, right? You got to navigate the process, and you got to figure out what's real, what's not, who's really on your team, who isn't. And then ultimately, when you do get that done, you can kind of sit back, whether somebody writes about it or covers it or not, you can look back. And I think back to my time, I worked for Marco Rubio in his office when I was still in the military as a defense fellow. And I remember the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, is a bill that passes every year. It's one of the few bills that passes every year. And we were working on this thing nonstop, and I was able to get a cyber piece in there. Nobody knew that there was this cyber amendment in there that added training and did all these things. So sometimes the wins aren't as obvious to everybody.
And sometimes they take a while to trickle down to the public, right? You even see that with infrastructure. Until you see a bridge being built in your community or the roads being fixed, you think, oh, okay, they're getting nothing done. And with all due respect, I do think that this caucus is an anomaly and an exception to the rule because there is tremendous gridlock on Capitol Hill. And granted, this doesn't get enough attention, but that doesn't, relieve the other people from the fact that they don't want to compromise, and they weaponize many of these issues instead of coming together. And I think the idea of having a nuanced conversation about some of these really challenging issues just doesn't happen. But, I want to take us back because it wasn't always this way. And in fact, Jonathan Haidt, who's a great writer, he traces the difference we're seeing now back to the 1990s and the Republican Revolution, when the GOP not only became more combative, but House Speaker Newt Gingrich discouraged new Republican members from having their families move to Washington, D.C., where they were likely to form more social ties with other members of their party and members of opposite party. And what are your thoughts on that? Because I've covered this a long time, this dysfunction on Capitol Hill, and a lot of people have said, you all don't spend any time together. You're not going out to dinner. You're not going on picnics with your families. You're not getting to know each other as human beings. Do you think that's a big problem?
Yeah, undoubtedly it is. I mean,
and also fundraising, by the way, right? You have to go home and raise money. You can't spend that much time in D.C.
Yeah. I mean, our caucus, I always explain our caucus as a trust caucus. I mean, fundamentally, it's about building trust. Sure. And we're veterans, and that's the basis upon which we build trust. Because we're not an ideological caucus. I mean, there's ideological caucuses of moderates, of progressives, of right wing, left wing. We're not. I mean, our caucus actually spreads the entire gamut from far right to far left. But the common tie is service to the country. And what you do is when you come to the table with that common tie, and we actually made a pledge, and Rai mentioned this at the beginning because veterans love pledges, right? And our pledge is very simple. And actually, we've kicked people out of the caucus, Republicans and Democrats. We've kicked them out for not abiding by the pledge, because we mean it. And the pledge is we're going to treat each other with civility and respect. We're not going to attack each other or campaign against each other. We're going to carry each other's legislation, and we're going to meet regularly and develop relationships. It's that simple.
Why
right?
isn't every caucus like that?
It should be.
Honestly, it just sounds so ridiculous. You've got the crazy, well, never mind. You've got all these crazy caucuses, and they're so extreme, and they're the loudest. They get the lion's share of attention on media, and particularly on social media. And have there ever been thoughts to diversify these caucuses, or is that just not the way it works?
Well, first off, there's 5,285 caucuses in Congress. I mean, there's a caucus for absolutely everything, right? And everybody wants you to get on their caucus to do whatever. But there's a difference between the caucuses that are serious and meaningful and thought-provoking and ultimately, want to navigate the process, and those that just meet to do other stuff.
What does that mean, do other stuff?
Fundraise, be around people that are just going to think exactly like you, maybe have one goal in mind. What I love about this caucus is we always focus on what unites us. And I think that's a very powerful reminder that in this country, more unites us than divides us. And our service is really what gives that initial trust. And then you go from there and you go, so when we talk about issues, when we start talking about veteran issues, we're not talking about some of the things that are going to put our members in bad spots. Like I already know, hey, we probably shouldn't talk, I don't ever want to put Jason in a bad spot. I also don't want to ever put any of my most conservative members and vice versa. So we're very conscious politically of going, instead of spending our time on the issues that is going to drag us into the mud, how about we spend the issues that are going to unite us? Veteran issues. I mean, real excited about the Global War on Terrorism Memorial. There's just all these very real things that this caucus works on.
Well, with all due respect, that's great, but a lot of these the biggest, most challenging issues facing our country are divisive. And we need to come up with solutions. We need to come up with compromise. And I'm curious how difficult it is for you all. I mean, because moderate anything has now become a dirty word, right? Compromise. Oh, God forbid we should meet in the middle on any of these issues. How much are these caucuses on the far right and the far left? How big a problem are they creating for you all? Because I don't think they represent the largest swath of the country. They are on the fringes. And how hard is it for you all to kind of fight those impulses?
It is hard because it drives a lot of the rhetoric. It drives a lot of the attention, right? So we're competing for attention. And by the way, I'm a pragmatic person. We work together, but I'm not necessarily a moderate. I'm moderate in some ways, but I'm a pretty progressive Democrat. And Tony's a pretty conservative Republican. And we disagree a lot. Right? 80-90% of the time we disagree on things, but we make a commitment to find that 10% and to try to build from there. Right? And we both agree that the earth is round and the sky is blue. We can agree on facts and have
the election was legitimate.
Exactly. Have debates around that.
Right.
But we do compete structurally. I'm just going to sit here, no comment on that one. We do agree on some basic facts, which matters a lot. But it comes back to the trust thing. And I remember, and it's not just putting this all on Congress and the contract with America and the 1990s thing. Yes, but that's also too easy. Right? It's all too easy to say this is all about structure and certain things in Congress. We can't ignore the larger trends that are going on in our society. I grew up in an Irish Catholic construction family of conservatives in the upper Midwest. Right? I was born and raised in Wisconsin, a family of construction workers. I worked in construction myself growing up, helped pay for college by working as a construction laborer. And most of my family, by the way, are supporters of Donald Trump, which makes for some really unusual Thanksgivings, let me tell you, especially after I prosecuted the first impeachment. That was an odd Thanksgiving for sure. But what I've seen is the American dream has eroded, and many of the people I grew up with and many of my family members have lost sight of or even think they can achieve that dream in a political system that is not responsive to that. The frustration is extremely real. right? And both sides, a lot of times, are not responsive to that frustration and those very, very, very real
kitchen table issues, really, right?
It is, and that's not to discount the fact that, yes, there's extreme racism and bigotry and misogyny that drive some of these extreme movements, that drive a lot of what's going on, but there's also a lot of good people that are extremely frustrated in America, that don't think the American dream is accessible to them, and they're right, and they want some big change.
And I'm interested to hear how you would describe sort of the frustration on the left, having just heard Jason describe some of the frustration primarily on the right, I would say.
Hey, I view it through the lens. I go back to my time in service, 20 years in the military, 5 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. I view it through the lens of what are we getting done? What can get done? You mentioned some of the most difficult problems. It's going to take political leadership to sit down at the table and arm wrestle over the topic. First, to have somebody that you can kind of come together with. And Jason hit it right on the head. It starts with trust. Bottom line, trust. Do I trust that Jason is going to try to hurt me in some form or fashion? Does he trust that I'm not going to do these things? And we start there, and then you build these relationships out. And what happens with this caucus, oftentimes we're talking about national security, but it bleeds over into other things where you start going, no, that's a member that I get along with. Going back to the relationship building.
Yeah.
You know, it really is about that. And that's a member I enjoy spending time with, that
I've gotten to know.
I've gotten to know. I know their family. I know that he's dealing or she is dealing with this, that, or the other. Because we're all people at the end of the day. It does get frustrating, but if you allow the system to consume you, you will immediately shut down. You have to, and I'm of the mindset, I'm not a fan of being on the outside of the system throwing rocks at it. I'm a fan of being inside the system, shaping the process from the inside. Going back to kind of Jason's point earlier, I'm on a caucus that there's 140 Republicans, very conservative, one of the largest conservative caucus in Congress, right? And I'm on that caucus.
What caucus is that?
It's the, I'm losing.
That's
what's
all right.
This RSC, the Republican Study Group. Thank you for the save. Republican Study Group, Study Committee. I'm on the RSC. I'm also on the Problem Solvers. Talk about one of the most moderate, half Democrats, half Republicans, and then I'm also on Fort Country Caucus. So, but at every single one of those, I see the exact same thing. Right? And so I just think that there's an opportunity to be able to, you have to be in the system though. If you want to change the system, it's real easy to throw rocks from afar and say, oh, you're terrible, you're terrible. It's much more difficult to sit down, having to listen to some of the rhetoric that's getting your blood boiling and still be able to go, all right, now how do we take it from here and move it to a positive direction?
You know, it's interesting, wanting to compromise, wanting to come up with solutions. I mean, it takes a lot of courage these days in our current political climate. And I'm curious, Tony, if you want to reach out to the other side, I mean, how often are you called a rhino?
Those are words.
I mean, I'm.
Yeah.
You have to deal with that all the time. You're being primaried
Sure.
By 5 people who are claiming to be, I don't know the specifics, but more conservative than you are. Yes,
of
you're
course.
being primaried from the right.
What you find is
So you're not getting rewarded for this kind of behavior, is what I'm saying.
Well, I mean, I've been a 2-term congressman. I'll get rewarded if I'm a 3-term congressman.
Yeah.
Right? And at the end of the day, you can't let the rhetoric stop you, and you can't let these people that are going to push back against you. And I guarantee Jason's getting pushed from the left. I'm sure he's not liberal enough. He's, why are you talking to Republicans? These are all risks that you take, but ultimately, if you're strong enough politically to withstand that, then that's your job, right? Not everybody wants to go down that route and kind of navigate it, but that's what we need. I'm of the belief that we need more people that are willing to get in the arena and be true who you are. If you're a liberal, if you're a conservative, whatever it is, just be genuine.
But
be a
also,
genuine actor.
Try to find solutions, right?
course.
How often are you criticized by, the left wing, the super progressive wing of your party, the squad, the AOCs of the world? Do you get criticized for reaching across the aisle and working with someone like Tony?
Not so much my colleagues, right? I mean, I'm actually really good friends with Alexandria, and I have a bill with Cory Bush and other folks, because I do that. I actually apply the same principle that I apply to Tony than I do my own colleagues on my own side of the aisle, right? I may not always agree with them on all things, but there are areas of collaboration that we can get work done. And this shouldn't be just a bipartisan element. This can be an intra-party element too, right? Because I think there is this sense right now that we need to hit all grand slams. Like we need to have the big transformative bill on all things. The reality is, structurally and with divided government and with a divided country, there are going to be very, very few grand slams, legislatively or anything else. And the reality also is, not to overuse sports analogies, but most baseball games are won by singles and doubles. Right? You win by getting wins consistently, repeatedly, over time. And that's the same thing with legislation. Right? It's very, very rare to get these massive transformative bills that come once every decade, once every 2 decades. But you do get a lot of incremental wins that build up over time, that build trust, that actually move the meter on substantive policy issues, and that show the country, and this is what our caucus is about, other than building trust between ourselves, demonstrating to our colleagues who are not a member of the caucus, but also demonstrating to the country that you can do this. It's the leadership by example we learned in the military. We will show people it can be done and hope that they join us.
If only you could get some coverage and let people know what you're doing, right? How much is social media entered into this picture? I mean, you mentioned it, and kind of people developing their own ecosystems and echo chambers. They're getting affirmation, not information now. But how has that made it even more challenging to reach across the aisle?
Well, it's a two-way street. One, it's an instrument that you can use to get your message out to the masses in a real-time environment. I spent 20 years in the military as a cryptologist. Information is how you win wars, right? You can shape the narrative. You can shape the battlefield. You can determine what the conversation is about. But on the other end, you're fighting a narrative maybe that you're against or that someone is against you. And so the truth is very hard to come by, because what does the truth look like to you? It varies. Depends on how a person consumes their information. It depends on where they're going. And so these are some of the obstacles that you have to overcome. Honestly, there's no way to get around it other than just elbow grease and working hard and just constantly echoing your message out on all platforms, newsletters and town halls and Facebook messages and Twitter and just all these places where people consume it. One of the things that I've done is one of the tools that we use, I call fish where the fish are at. Most people, believe it or not, are not following politics. Most people don't know who their member of Congress is. Most people aren't going to political rallies, but every person in America has an opinion on what is happening in the world, whether fill in the blank, right? So my thought process is I go to where they work at. I go where they're at, and I'm not spewing, hey, vote for Republican Tony Gonzales this day. I go, what is happening in your world, in your environment, and how can we be helpful? How do you bridge that divide of people that have ultimately been forgotten and don't feel as if they have a voice in the political system, and then be able to engage them? And then ultimately I offer them the number one thing that I could possibly offer to anybody, which is a passport or a visa to Cancun or Mexico, right? So I'm like, all right, if you need a passport, I got all this stuff. But if you need a passport to Cancun, I know a guy that can help you. And they're all like, okay, got it. So you should have led with that, right? You got to be able to deliver something real for them.
Little Ted Cruz humor, if anybody missed that. What about for you, Jason? I mean, how do you fight against? Because, there have been studies, and the very extremes, as I mentioned, are the loudest voices on social media and don't represent the majority of Americans. So how do you deal with kind of people trying to back you into a corner or criticize you for not having a certain ideology or being doctrinaire enough, if you will?
Well, I try to, there's this thing called retail politics. There's wholesale politics, which is, mass communications, TV ads, mass mail, but retail politics are the town halls, just the connection. And, social media is dehumanizing. There's no doubt about that. I mean, it's interesting. We have these frequent flyers on our social media accounts that, just say the most awful things about us, and they do it all the time, right? And sometimes these people show up to my town halls, and they're actually really delightful to me personally.
I know people.
And I'll be like, Dave, you say terrible things about me. He's like, oh, I just do that because it's fun. I'm like, well, it's not fun, right?
Yeah.
It's not fun for me. But it certainly drives some of the more extreme voices. But I'm worried about what's about to happen, right? I know there's been a number of events and panels about AI. AI is about to supercharge this in a way that we are not remotely ready for it. Deep fakes, disinformation, bots. This is about to be on supercharged steroids in a way that not many people really fully understand, and it has the potential of radically altering the political landscape for folks, and we're not talking about it enough, and there's really no conceivable path right now to regulating it.
It's really scary, isn't it?
It's very scary.
And everybody knows it's coming, but
It's here.
yeah, exactly, but nobody seems to have the political will, or nobody really knows what to do about it, I guess. We were talking about rhetoric, and and kind of being pushed into a box, Tony, and you have reached across the aisle, which is verboten according to some people in your party. You actually got censured.
Sure.
By state Republicans in Texas. Talk to me about what that was like and how you withstood that kind of pressure.
Yeah, first, it's never fun when your own party is attacking you, and just an added layer of drama that you got to deal with. But ultimately, why are you here? Why are you serving? Why are you in this seat with a seat at the table, one of 435 members? You're here to make change, and you're here to make a difference, and that's not always easy. Essentially, I got censured by the party because I voted after the Robb Elementary shooting in Uvalde, which is in my district. 19 children who were murdered, 2 teachers. I mean, literally the day after that shooting, I sat down with a parent, and the first thing out of that gentleman's mouth was, "Tony, make sure they don't take my guns away." I mean, his daughter was murdered the day before. It's the first thing out of his mouth, okay? 2 days later, I sit down with another parent. The first thing out of her mouth is, make sure they banned assault weapons. Welcome to my district, okay? Where everybody wants different things. Afterwards, everyone kept calling me and saying, "Tony, we got to do something, but make sure they don't take my guns away." That was the sentiment. So we built out this Safer Community Act. It's the largest investment in mental health in our nation's history. Did not infringe upon the Second Amendment at all. But that gets spun, right? It gets spun one way or another, because if you take one step down a road, all of a sudden that's a threat to a lot of people. So I got censured for that. But guess what? If that piece of legislation, the Safer Community Act, was law before the Uvalde shooting, it would have prevented the Uvalde shooting. So I will vote for that 1,000 times over. Since that piece of legislation was signed into law, this is the sad part. There's been over 200 cases where a similar shooting like Uvalde was prevented. So that's the takeaway, is we have a deep, serious issue in this country that we have to get ahead of. And it's going to take people that are bold and can navigate the process. I'm of the mindset it doesn't have to be either or. It doesn't. We can protect the Constitution, and we can protect our children in school. It does not have to be either or, but it's going to take caucuses like ours. I know ours is predominantly a focus on military and national security, but it's going to take people that can navigate it. Jason can go back to his crazy left-wing friends. I can go back to my crazy right-wing friends, and we go, all right, now let's get together, and how do we navigate this? There's people that on his side are never going to talk to me. There's people on my side that are never going to talk to him. There have to be bridges that connect everything together, especially when we want to solve the very complicated issues.
What happens when you're censured? They just basically said, you're a bad person. What happens?
One of the things was they said I wasn't going to get any financial support, and I immediately chuckled and said, "Have you ever given me financial support?" I never got any financial support, but it's more of a nobody knows what that means, but it sounds serious,
and it's sort of embarrassing, or they try to make it embarrassing.
I mean, the way I handled it is I gave it right back to them. My style is I give as good as I get, right? And I'm gonna, you're gonna poke me in the chest. I'm gonna poke you in the chest.
And in fact, you did something that was pretty effective. Explain to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm Mexican American. I represent a district that's predominantly Mexican American, 72% Hispanic. And there's a term, and it's a kind of a loosely interpreted term, which is perfect. It could be really offensive or a little bit offensive, depending on how you interpret it, not what I'm saying. And so I immediately came out and I tweeted. I said, it's all puro pedo. And essentially, I'll pick it in the middle. It basically says they're full of it, and they don't know what they're talking about, is one way you could take it. And I tweeted that out. The very next day, it's on the front page of the San Antonio Express News, right? Tony gets censored, it's puro pedo. And from there, everybody who is Mexican-American, from a cultural standpoint, is like, Tony's my guy, right? Tony, like, he got hit, and he immediately said, I brushed it off, and I kept going forward. So, I mean, it's all about how you handle some of these attacks. Because a lot of people want you to get in the mud with them. They want you to wrestle with them. They want you to be focused on what they want to be focused on. I'm going, meanwhile, back at the ranch, I'm focused on securing the border, lowering inflation, access to health care, like serious issues. I don't have time for these party people that are just upset for one thing or another.
I'd love to ask you about sort of a couple of Supreme Court decisions, if I could. Just
some easy ones.
Yeah, just because it's so timely. First, this week, the Supreme Court rejected a legal theory that state legislatures have almost unlimited power to decide the rules for federal elections and draw partisan congressional maps without interference from state courts. Trump allies had raised the theory as part of an effort to reverse the 2020 election outcome. So how do you feel about the Supreme Court rejecting that legal theory, which our very own Neil Katyal, who's talking about the Supreme Court elsewhere, argued before the High Court? Jason, why don't I start with you?
Well, I like it, obviously, right? I mean, it's a great, the two rulings, the Alabama ruling on redistricting and then this really pretty absurd theory about the role of state legislatures or politicians in states to overrule courts or to supersede court rulings. I have not been a fan of this court in a lot of ways, including the decision today, which I vehemently disagree with. But those two rulings were a breath of fresh air, I have to say, in our democracy, particularly on the redistricting, because if there's one thing that if I could wave my magic wand and address the partisanship, the divide, the vitriol, and extremism in American politics, it's ending gerrymandering. If you do that and get more pragmatic, regular folks to the table, it would overnight change the makeup of Congress and the tenor of the discussions.
We'll talk about gerrymandering in a moment, but I'm just curious, Tony, how you felt about a couple of those decisions, and I'd love you to weigh in on the affirmative action decision.
Yeah, I mean,
Let's start with the state legislature.
I'll talk with the first one, then I'll talk about affirmative action. I mean, what if I told you politics was all about power, and all it was about was either liberal or conservative power? Pure, raw political power. And this is something that plays a large part of it. And sometimes you can't take it personal. Like, it has nothing to do with you. You're just not a Democrat, or you're just not a Republican, or you're just not Democrat enough or Republican enough. It's all about political power in a lot of ways. You start talking about gerrymandering, I think back to my time in service when I was in Afghanistan, and I'm 19 years old. We had just taken Kandahar airfield. I land in Kandahar, and there's nothing but poppy fields as far as the eye can see, and I go, holy smokes, I'm no longer in Texas. Okay, there's it's the middle of nowhere, and then there's this beautiful Land Rover, white Land Rover that's coming here, and I'm going, I felt like I was on the moon. I'm like, how did this Land Rover get on the moon? It was the local warlord, and behind him was a pickup truck with a dozen guys with AKs and RPGs, and I'm kind of, what's happening here? And my senior chief's like, no, those are our allies. I go, those are our allies? And I think back to that time to go, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. So now let me tie it into the gerrymandering. You look at the state of Illinois and you go, well, that looks gerrymandered. But you look at another side, they're like, no, it works for us because we're the ones that are going to benefit politically. You look at the state of New York, same thing. There's some very clear, obvious gerrymandering that happens on all sides. You look at other states that were overturned, but it all boils down to political power. We got to understand that going forward. On the affirmative action position, I'm of the mindset, when I was in service, I served with all different types of people, Hispanic, African American, Asian, gay, straight, Jew, Catholic, didn't matter. All different types of people. And I would love for this country to get back to us being Americans. Yes, we're different. Every single one of us in this room is different. And that's part of what makes America special, is we are all different. But what also makes us special is we are all Americans. And the more we can unite and not divide, I think it's a powerful thing. So, in that case, I think the affirmative action position, I think it's come to an end.
And I'd like you to comment on that.
This goes in one of the areas of categories where Tony and I are going to respectfully disagree. I think this is a move in the wrong direction. There was a very interesting. I read the decision this morning, and what not a lot of people have noticed is that there was a footnote in the majority decision. What the footnote in the majority decision says is essentially, this decision does not apply to the United States military academies because there are unique considerations that go towards our military. And I'm thinking to myself, well, wait a minute. What are they really saying here? They're saying here that diversity does matter if it comes to our national defense, and that communities of color are good enough to fight and die for our country, and that's okay, but not necessarily in every other context. And what I hear from my district, which is actually one of the most diverse districts in the nation, over 20% of my constituents were born outside of the country. I have 120 languages spoken in my district, and what I hear a lot from them is that things like that just reinforce this notion that there's this dual standard, that you are okay. It's okay to have you fight and die for our nation, but in every other realm of American society, we're going to have a different standard. And you're not okay to be on a level playing field and to participate fully. And I just fully disagree with that. And that the message that decision sends.
Let's talk about each of your parties, because tomorrow morning, I think it's tomorrow morning. I've been doing so many of these. I'm interviewing Karl Rove, and the title of that conversation is The Elephant in the Room, which, by the way, I got from ChatGPT. I said, I need a cute title for this conversation.
Yeah.
That was a good title, right?
Sure.
Anyway, and I'd love you to say, what is wrong with each of your party? And Tony, just lay it out. What is wrong with the Republican Party? And don't worry, Jason, you'll have your turn too.
I look at the Republican Party right now. Everyone's so angry, and maybe rightfully so angry. That they are rightfully angry. They're rightfully angry at all these different, very progressive, different ideas that they feel that they are under attack, and that has angered them. And they have stayed in this anger zone and not moved into the solution zone, and not moved into, well, what is our message? What are we going to do? What are we going to provide to the country? How are we going to fix it? Instead of in the attack mode of, look how terrible they are. Look how crazy this notion is. And I think the longer you stay in that anger, demonize one another, the more dangerous it is for this country. I've always thought the greatest threat to the United States is ourselves. No one will ever defeat us. No one. China, Russia, Iran, no one. We are a resilient country. We've always been a resilient country. But we are starting to be defeated from the inside out by demonizing and attacking one another.
And our enemies are actually sowing that discontent through what they've done in 2016 and 2020 in terms of disinformation. I mean,
then they go, well, then they go, well, we can have our own dictatorships in our countries, and the United States shouldn't be involved. And they have really serious problems, to your point.
Yeah. Jason, what about you? I mean, do you feel that the Democratic Party spends too much time attacking and not enough time standing for something?
No, I don't view that as the problem. I think the Democratic Party defends. I think we do stand for something, right? We're about a level playing field, giving people opportunity, and fighting for working class folks. But what I think our blind spot is, which is substantial, is severalfold. Number one, there are a lot of folks that do not understand the plight of vast swaths of this nation, and the real struggles that people are going through. And number two, we like to talk at people. Like we have all the solutions, right? And I'll use the example of growing up. when I was working in construction, I was a laborer, so I was, laying asphalt parking lots in 100-degree heat and digging foundations. And when you arrived at the construction site at 5 a.m., everyone would shake hands. But it wasn't actually a handshake. It was a callus check. Right? You're shaking the person's hands because you want to feel what kind of hands they have. And that would tell you who they are. Right? Is it working person's hands? And then nothing else really mattered beyond that, right? And for me, that's trust, right? We can have the best 21-point policy positions and white papers and best platforms in the world. But if we're talking down to people, and if they don't trust us, and if we don't listen to them, and if they don't feel like that we're one of them and we can connect, none of that matters. It just doesn't matter. We're not having, as a nation, we're not having a policy discussion. We're having a discussion about identity, about belonging, about dignity, and about tribalism to some degree, and tribes that are being generated that were all going into our corners, and that is the fundamental political challenge of our time.
Before I open up to questions, Tony, I think I should ask you about the elephant in the room, and that's Donald Trump.
Sure.
How are you feeling about his candidacy? How do you feel about January 6th, and how hard is it for you to wade into this?
Well, I tell you, if former President Trump gets indicted one or two more times, this thing is over in a landslide in his favor. That's the part people don't understand. Every time he gets attacked, every time he gets indicted, every time something happens, everyone thinks it's a negative against him. It's the exact opposite. And what is happening is folks within the Republican Party are going, see, it's a witch hunt. I told you it was a witch hunt. What one person happens, it doesn't equate to the other. I mean, look I spent 20 years in the intelligence community with a top secret clearance. I worked in a space where when you were done with the day, how was your day? It was fine. What did you do? A little this, a little that. If I had classified material, I would go to jail for a long time. In the last couple months, who have we found that have classified material? Former President Trump, current President Biden, former President Pence. So it's not just this one person, one time, it's across the board. So every time something happens that everyone goes, this is the one, all it does is get President Trump stronger.
Okay, Jason, help me out here. They're very different situations. Go ahead.
Well,
one was in a Corvette and the other one was in a bathroom.
Yeah,
Go ahead, defend it.
I don't think there's, I'm not going to give into what I believe to be somewhat of a false equivalency here, right? I mean, listen, I was trapped in the gallery on January 6th, right? I was one of those 24 members of Congress who were surrounded by that mob that were trapped and had to be rescued by a SWAT team as people were, banging down the doors, and we were, literally piling trash cans and chairs against the doors and erecting a barrier to stop that mob from killing us. But, I thought about that as I was sitting on that side of the door, and that mob was banging down the doors or trying to. I thought about the fact that a lot of my fellow veterans were actually on the other side of that door, right? And I've struggled with this idea of how do two people that come from very similar backgrounds, both who raise their right hand and take an oath to the Constitution in good faith and discharge that oath and serve the country, and then they leave service and they take different paths, how do they go from brothers and sisters in arms to then diverging and converging again on opposite sides of that door? And to me, that's the story of the last 20 years in America, of how we have divided ourselves, of how we have the impact of disinformation and misinformation, the weaponization that Donald Trump has used at extremism, loading that cannon up and shooting it towards the Capitol as he did on January 6th. And it wasn't just him. He weaponized what was already existing. But I do agree with Tony in one way. And the antidote to this is not to just go after Donald Trump. The antidote to this is to address the issue I talked about earlier. Right? I would love to just ignore Donald Trump, because I do think that every time I attack him or go after him, it gives him power, right? Yeah. And instead, just don't give him any energy and airtime and address that underlying issue, right? And there is some balance there, because I'm not going to completely ignore him. Right? I'm not somebody that's just going to sit there and let extremism go unchecked. If somebody says something that attacks my constituents or attacks vulnerable communities or empowers white supremacy or goes after communities of colors, you're damn right I'm going to say something about it and I'm going to call it out because you can't ignore it. But at the same time, you have to find that balance between just always doing that, and there's always a reason to do that, versus pursuing our own agenda in building up trust and getting things done and addressing the underlying divisions in our country.
Tony, do you want to add anything to that? I mean, I interpret your answer to say, I understand what you're saying, the impact of the indictments, but does this also mean that you are still supporting Donald Trump?
I mean, what frustrates me is, and believe it or not, the world isn't equal. And once again, I go back to that moment where one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. And it's how you view the world. And that is what's happening in this country. If one person does something and they happen to be a Democrat or they happen to be President Biden, well, that's okay. If another person does something, if it's the former President Trump, and they're a Republican, well, that's okay. Instead of calling balls and strikes, instead of going, no, that's wrong, no, that's right. We're getting further and further away from that, and we're getting more of having to defend our different groups instead of going, let's get back to putting, the country, and that's part of what this caucus does, put the country above politics, right? And oh, by the way, you can support someone and they can still be wrong. They can still do wrong things. It doesn't have to be just because you're my party or just because you're not my party, everything you do is wrong.
Do you think there's a double standard, Jason, going on?
No, I do. I understand what Tony is saying. We've had this debate, right? We have this, and we're still friends, and we're still going to work together. But I don't want to buy into this false equivalency that there are extremes on both sides, and we both have to deal with it, because I just don't think that's true. I think that there is right now in this moment, and it hasn't always been true, but in this moment there is a type of extremism that's uniquely dangerous to our nation. And my view is that extremism exists predominantly on the right? It's just the truth, right? That it's been weaponized. It's dangerous. We've seen attacks on folks, and we have to address it. I don't think we can say it's the same on both sides. Now, I do deal with issues on the left that I disagree with ardently. I do. But there is a unique threat that I think in this moment that faces us, and we have to be honest about that.
I feel
just one brief thing, and I'd say this: as fun as it is to talk about Donald Trump and Joe Biden, I like to focus on Congress because it's easy for us to go, oh, look how terrible they are. Meanwhile, we're pretty damn terrible ourselves, right? So if we could solve Congress and stop punting the ball to the executive branch, I think that in itself is important.
Let's take a couple quick questions. The gentleman with the Yale cap, my safety school. Hello.
I heard you discussing caucuses before. I am very involved in one that I assume neither one of your members, and that's the no-label, the Problem Solvers Caucus, which represents a centrist down the middle. It eliminates both fringes, but if you want to get something done, getting the middle lined up in cohesiveness. If the moderate Republicans and the moderate Democrats get together, we could do anything.
I'm part of the Problem Solvers Caucus.
Yay!
I'm on the
I liked you.
I'm on the Problem Solvers Caucus. The problem I have with the Problem Solvers Caucus is we're the solution-oriented people. We want to find a solution to a problem. Imagine you're sitting across from a person that is not a rational actor, and you're the only rational actor. So what ends up happening is you do all the give, and they do all the take. And I'm of the mindset it's time for the center to push back, to give just as good as they get, and to push back and go, no, let's come with a solution. It seems as if the problem solvers are always the ones that are going to bail, always the ones that are going to give. And that's the only issue I'd add there.
Well, I'm on your side. I think we should be more proactive and not give in as much. But anyway, I'm glad. But I would think also that your caucus that you have and if you get together, that gives you double strength.
That's right.
The real alliance between the two.
You look at legislative productivity, does largely happen in the middle, right? The vast majority of the legislative productivity, just in terms of sheer bills passed, happens within the middle of both parties.
I understand No Labels is trying to put out a third-party candidate, though, so I don't think that's such a good idea, sir. But anyway, we could discuss it after the panel, because I want to go to this nice lady in the animal print.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm a vet, and the person sitting next to me spent 20 years in the Air Force.
Thank you both for your service.
Thank you, thank you. But the service in my family goes back to the Spanish-American War. Mm-hmm. And when I look at the kinds of things that are happening in America, I'm also concerned. I'm concerned about the Supreme Court and what happened today. I'm from Alabama, and I have to navigate a lot of red territory that is still grounded in white supremacy. And as we're going to talk about the change that needs to happen, I think the first thing that needs to happen is that we should bring all vets together, and every person that serves in the House and the Senate should have some military experience. Because one of the things that I learned how to do when I was in the military was how to get along with people. And I think if we don't change, we're going to go back and fight that war that we fought before, which was called the Civil War, and it was over slavery. And some of these same issues are resonating today, and they have not been solved. So I would like to suggest, one, is that come to my community so you can see the raw sewage on the ground. That's between Selma and Montgomery. And it's not just there. I'm hearing from people in Colorado. I'm hearing from people in California. I know it's in Texas, especially along the Colonias. So we have to acknowledge that we do not have the type of government that we should have. But I applaud the two of you for getting together and talking. And what we try to do with the work that we do, we go and talk to people to try to resolve these issues. And I think that. And I stood up just to say, I'm writing a book that's coming out next year. I'd like to interview both of you.
I like her. She knows how to get a guest. She knows how. Why don't you approach them after the panel?
I'd love to. Thank you.
Would you all be willing to talk to her?
We'll chat,
I'd like to seal the deal for her.
We'll talk.
Wait, so we're out of time, but do you all have any final thoughts? I don't know, maybe end on a note of hope and optimism, given the really sort of vitriolic and difficult time we're all experiencing. Jason, why don't you start?
Sure. Yeah, I would not be doing this job if I didn't have hope, right? Because I could go spend more time with my kids and just enjoy myself if I thought that the ship was sinking. But I don't, right? And I do believe this is worth fighting for, and I gain solace from our history. We've been through tough times before, and the beauty of our structure, the beauty of America is not that we're perfect, but that we are resilient, we are self-correcting, and it's the pursuit of that promise. It's the pursuit of the perfection, and that we can be something better. And it goes to what you said, ma'am, about the challenges and coming to terms with our past, which I think is actually key here. I've been talking about this notion recently of a new American patriotism, where I think we should invigorate a new American patriotism where we can be proud of our country, but in a new way. Not where we whitewash over the past and ignore the past, but where we embrace our original sins and our mistakes, where we're honest about that, but we can also be proud of our ability to correct it and to come together and do great things. We can do both, and we must do both, and I think we can. And our numbers are growing. We're getting more and more attention as time goes. We obviously would love you all to help us engage with this project and get the message out so that we can recruit more folks.
Tony?
Katie, I've been all over the world twice over. We live in the greatest country on earth. And if you don't believe that, go take some foreign travel. Go see some other places. We live in the greatest country on earth, and we need to remember that we have more in common than we don't. We are different. We're all very different people. We have different ideas, and that is okay. That is what makes our country great. It is okay for members of Congress to have different views of how the world should be. It is also important that we sit down and ultimately do one thing: deliver. Talk is cheap. It's all about what you can get done. And while we get pulled in all these different directions that are very important topics, meanwhile, back at the ranch, people have very serious issues. Most people are trying to put food on the table, make sure their kids are safe, do the simple things, and we can't get away from that. It's a big part of what this caucus does, is we look for ways to come together and solve real problems.
Well, thank you both for
Thanks.
your service, and thank you for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.